Yet another week comes to an end. Here we are, having some drinks. Mine looks pink today, and trying to solve the world's problems. As usual, if you think we know anything about what we're talking about, you probably need one of these, eh? Speaking of which, gents, what are we drinking this week? Unfortunately, we must start with the mustard-colored panted gentleman. Your socks are a lot more normal this week. Navy blue?
Navy blue.
I got it right today. Apparently it's purple.
Purple?
Yes, purple. Royal purple.
That's a thing?
It is, actually.
Okay. Anyway. But you're not wearing pajamas. Mustard is better than ice cream. What are you drinking today?
I'm actually very excited today. I got acquainted with Kericho tea some 12, 15 years ago. And it's lovely. It's the best tea in Africa. It's from Kenya.
You've got a thing for East African things, eh?
I do.
Should we maybe explore this a bit more?
Not quite. Not on this particular show, but I thoroughly enjoy East Africa. And Kericho tea, it's one of the best. It's smooth. It doesn't have an aftertaste, and that's what I'm enjoying today.
Yeah, it's also quite strong.
Really?
It is. The best teas are anywhere made around the equator.
Really?
Yeah. The soils as well as the climate. So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Learn something new. Not sure what use it is to know that, but okay.
Well, it's also very healthy.
Yeah.
This tea apparently is good for you.
Okay. So is water.
So try it once in a while.
Rufaro, why am I having a pink drink and you are having a yellow one?
Okay. Firstly, that is not a pink drink. Not
So you're on a roll with colors today, eh?
It might actually be pink, but I mean, when I say pink drink, it's pink drinks are characteristically sweet and feminine. This is anything but.
This is true. I've tasted it. Yep.
It's not supposed to look that way, by the way. I failed miserably when making it. It's supposed to be, it is a New York whiskey sour, and it's supposed to have, it has a bit of red wine in it, and the red wine is supposed to form a layer at the top. It shouldn't look like that. It should basically look mostly like my drink with a layer of red at the top. So clearly, I'm not a certified bartender, and I should put these cocktails together. Perhaps I shouldn't have a few drinks before I put the cocktails. Mine is a traditional, it's not a traditional whiskey sour. It's a Banting-friendly whiskey sour. So basically, it's made with a bourbon, which is today we're having Maker's Mark, which is one of the better ones. And it's basically a cocktail that's made of a bourbon, some freshly squeezed lemon juice, some egg white. That's where the frothy head and silky texture comes from. In a traditional whiskey sour, you add corn syrup and you garnish with a slice of orange and a cherry. But because we're Banting, we have forgone all the sugar in the corn syrup. And I've garnished mine with a slice of lemon. So,
how come I didn't get lemon? Anyway.
Because yours is a New York version. It has wine instead of lemon.
Well, anyway. Cheers.
So, am I any good as a cocktail barman?
I think I like it. The taste suggests that tomorrow morning is going to be tough. But we live and learn. We'll find out tomorrow. Gents, it's been an interesting week. Weather's been a little bit warmer than the previous couple of weeks.
Cheers to that.
Yep. The local news cycle has been a bit slow, but the international news cycle has been on fire. We all have been glued to our phones and our screens looking at what's happening south of the Limpopo. There's a huge political backstory, but I think what's of interest to us is people going around looting shops and expressing their anger on the streets. without going into the detail of the causes of their anger, what's our reaction to people expressing themselves this way, or society expressing itself this way?
Oh, shock and awe, in 3 words, but to be expected. I think if you look at what's been happening in Southern Africa, right? You had Eswatini, you had Mozambique, and then you have what's happening in South Africa, and backdrop what was happening in Zimbabwe in 2019. So if one were to look at it from a historic perspective, this is probably one of the heights of instability within the region that we've had for a very long time. We have usually been a very stable region, but I think the instability over the last 2 years, and more so over the last 2 months, it's unsettling and unnerving, especially when you look at what's happening in Durban and certain parts of Johannesburg. It is the looting, the rioting, it's unprecedented. It's something that perhaps South Africa has not gone through since it ushered its democracy in 1994. So I think at this point, I would like to say it's unnerving, it's shock and awe. But in the grand scheme of things, if you look at what's happening in Africa, maybe not so much. If you look at what's happening in the world, maybe not so much. We see what's happening in Cuba, Colombia, Haiti,
Ethiopia.
Exactly. There's a lot that has shifted. I suppose with the coronavirus, a lot of things shifted, especially in South Africa. South Africa was already an economy that was teetering on, it's on a depression. So it wasn't exactly a depression, but it was growing at marginally 0 point something percent. So when you have an external shock like this pandemic, what it does is it exposes the fragility. So it's not so much the reason why those people are rioting, but it just shows us just how fragile our democracies are in Africa, if this is happening to a state like South Africa. But I would like to get deeper into understanding it, but let's hear what Rufaro thinks.
Well, the first thought that occurs to me is that it speaks to a failure in leadership. So this is not a uniquely African phenomenon. So if you remember, in the US on the 6th of January, you had scenes of violence. The Capitol was stormed, and this is a first world country with per capita GDP over $50,000 a year. So they're not a poor country. They're developed. They don't have any of the sort of issues that we have in this part of the world. But you saw this kind of mob behavior. And what I think what we saw happen in the US in January has in common with what we're seeing happening in South Africa is that you have certain populist voices that instigate and fan the fringes of society that would be given to behaving in a particular fashion. So I think that it's something that we've seen all over the world: the rise of populism and the rise of this leadership style that inflames, infuriates, and builds outrage.
But Rufaro, you're quick to de-link it from poverty or poor countries. But do we see millionaires on the street? Be it in America or in South Africa? Do we not see that there's a commonality between the kind of people on the street, that what thing they all have in common is they are among the poorest in that particular society?
That may well be true, but I think that that's not the key driver. And I think that there's an essay that I saw today that had an interesting insight. So one of the narratives that's being bandied about what's happened in South Africa is that the primary cause of the violence and looting that we've seen is exactly what you're speaking to, which is poverty, unemployment, wealth inequality, right? But when you actually look at what's happening in South Africa objectively, and you look at where we are seeing looting and violence, right? It's mostly in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, right? These are not the only places in South Africa where unemployment, poverty, and wealth inequality
But
occur.
they're the most populous.
They might be the most populous, but if the primary driver of this was poverty and wealth inequality, this would be happening across the country, right? So it's happening in a particular part of the country's geography with a particular ethnicity, right? It's not a coincidence.
No. We've heard videos of Shona people looting.
Yes, okay. There have been people who've been looting opportunistically, but I think that those who are, legitimately angry, right, are people who are disappointed that or upset that Jacob Zuma is in jail.
Yeah,
so you've got to, there are obviously criminals and people who are just opportunistically looting, who actually don't care about any of the issues and just see an opportunity to steal, right? There've been videos of white people stealing
and cops.
So there's that aspect of it, and then there's the other aspect of it that I think is more political or is more to do with a groundswell of anger and frustration.
Tinashe, you're trying to come in.
Yeah.
And you're being very polite today. I think you should bring more of that stuff.
It's very helpful, actually.
It must have a sense of
karma. It might be a good time to explain to you guys and to the world in general.
This moment was always coming.
The inequality, the issue of inequality, and they usually use Gini coefficient. And a lot of people actually don't understand.
What is the Gini coefficient?
That's why I thought, it might be useful to understand that. So it's a ratio between 0 and 1. Mm-hmm. So anywhere between 0 and 1. And 0 is when there is no inequality whatsoever. So when your incomes are the same, so either
perfectly communist
or perfectly unemployed.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
And then 1 is when you have someone who has absolutely nothing and someone else who has all the money.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right? And I always ask this question, that suppose there are 2 of us and I earn $150 and you earn 0. Mm-hmm. What's our Gini coefficient?
It's 1.
Does it mean that I'm rich?
No.
Oh, indeed, does it mean there's a problem?
Yeah, absolutely, George. That's a good question.
I mean, none of us here can run as fast as Usain Bolt, right? So why do people even think, why is there even an expectation that there should be some level of equality in the world?
So what happened in 2015? There's a famous economist, French economist, Piketty, and
he got me very popular, very famous. If I don't know,
well, he is actually.
I'm very ignorant.
You're actually very fortunate not to know about him, because he wrote close to 700 pages, and I doubt that people who really parrot and push his ideas have actually read the 700 pages. But he's got very exciting and very inflammable anecdotes in there. And one of which is he makes this argument called R is greater than G. That is the interest rate that capitalists gets from their money whenever it's greater than the rate of growth in an economy. That's when the inequality increases. Now, that's all gibberish.
That makes sense.
And useless. Well,
I'm a student of corporate finance. It makes sense. But okay, why is it a problem?
It is not a problem. That's what I mean. But he thought it was a problem. Now, the issue is the context in which he was saying it, if you really think about it. In a developed country where you have unemployment close to 0 and almost everybody is earning something, it might be a useful thing to know, right? Oh, okay. Employment is next to 0 and people are earning, but you have higher earners. So it might be an interesting thing and fascinating thing to know. But when you have a country like Zimbabwe where you have unemployment rate close to 90%, it becomes quite
Depends
problematic.
who's measuring.
Oh,
Zimstad has a different number.
Well, whatever you want to use. In South Africa, the official unemployment rate, I think it's what,
32%?
32%. Youth unemployment is close to 50%. So in a country like that, it becomes, spurious, to say the very least. It's redundant. It's not useful. But for whatever reason, so the Gini coefficient is from an Italian economist.
Shall we just maybe just stick to saying measure of wealth inequality?
Measure of wealth inequality. What it means.
Why do we care about wealth inequality at all?
But that's his point. That's the point he's trying to make.
That's the point I'm making.
With lots of words. he's trying to say, why does it matter? What really matters, the problem is not the gap between the rich and the poor. The problem, I presume, is how poor the poor are and why the poor are poor.
Absolutely. That's where our concern should be. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Then the second thing I wanted to say.
Did I just paraphrase you nicely and you agreed?
I totally agree, George.
I totally agree. Well done, George.
Good choice of drinks today.
I think so. We should try this next week. The other thing we wanted to talk about is the sporadic rioting. We as Zimbabweans, and we've experienced this. If you remember the land reform, the land invasions, and we were told they were sporadic. But I think if we are students of Zimbabwean politics, and perhaps South Africa could learn a thing or two, we know that these things are hardly sporadic. And unfortunately, what it has shown us is just how politicians are willing to really, push their own agendas and lead to such riotous acts.
I like the point that you're making. Not that, because I agree with it, but I think it dovetails with something that I was saying earlier and thinking about. That so you have people who are disenfranchised, poor, struggling, feeling left behind. Okay, and
they're stealing dishwashers.
No, that's not the point I want to make. Let me finish.
Okay.
And they're probably not in the best position to figure out how they ended up where they are and why, right? Mm-hmm. And then enters the populist who says, you know what? The reason why you're in this position is because there's this particular group of people that is disenfranchising you, that is taking
this sounds a lot like 1932, 1933 in Germany.
Yeah. So, and it's the same thing. If you listen to populist rhetoric, they never talk about growing the pie, making it bigger, and lifting everybody out of poverty. They talk about how the people who don't have are in this position because the haves who don't deserve it, or some of the haves, are bad. And they don't deserve what they have, and that's the reason why you guys don't have. So we need to redress this injustice, and that's what fans outrage and anger, because not only am I upset that I have this poor quality of life, right? I become enraged that it's so and so's fault, and and this is what the populists do very well. They stir up all this emotion.
But I think this argument is a very dangerous one for us to be making over a bottle of bourbon and a whiskey sour and imported tea. There'll be a lot of people sitting out there saying, well, you guys are the bourgeoisie. You will spew this rhetoric. Perhaps let's step back and let's look at really what has happened objectively in the world over the last generation. So over the last generation, we've gone from nearly a third of the world living in extreme poverty to less than 10% of the world living in extreme poverty. And this is despite the definition of extreme poverty having been revised from $1 a day to $1.90 a day. So if we kept the same definition of extreme poverty, probably we are now around 5 or 6% of the world's population living in extreme poverty. So over the last 30 years, it's been the best time in human history of reducing extreme poverty and reducing income inequality in the world. But when you look a bit deeper into it, this development has really been because of progress specifically in China and in India. Obviously because they are disproportionate they're disproportionate in the
Yeah.
in the global population, and they've pulled so many people out of extreme poverty that the overall level of extreme poverty in the world has massively reduced over 30 years. I don't believe this has happened at any other stage in human history.
But
And
just
yet-
in China, even in South Africa, in the post-apartheid era, they've lifted 12 million people out of poverty. So they've made progress, right? But if you are not in the demographic,
Can I ask my question?
okay, sorry.
And yet, let's leave Zim on the side, but we have greater global discontent about wealth inequality than at any other point in human history. Help me understand this. Why is that?
I can help you. It's a Marxist theory, and if you're a Marxist, you would actually understand this. The idea of a Marxist theory is nihilistic at
You've
its
got
core.
lots of big words today.
Not just today.
It's
And Rufaro and I started early.
okay.
Speak to our 6-year-old.
6-year-old. Okay, let me simplify. The idea is there's something wrong with the world. So you've given a very good, nice idea of how poverty has been reduced over the last century. But it does not mean that everything is perfect. But the Marxist believes that there's still a class struggle, right? That there are people who are making more than they should, more than they deserve. And these people are the capitalists. And their idea is when you look at the capitalist, and remember their version of what a capitalist is, surprisingly changes every decade. But they have it that the capitalist, for example, they will say Jeff Bezos is a capitalist. But Jeff Bezos is actually not a capitalist.
Well, he controls
But-
capital. He is a capitalist.
No, he's not a capitalist.
And
when you
is
think
being a
about
capitalist a bad thing?
when you think about it, he's actually given capital, right?
Yes, but
And he uses other people's capital. And the capital that he actually uses are workers' capital. So coming back to South Africa, for example, the PIC is a $2 trillion company, investment company. It's run by Black people. It's owned by Black people. And the biggest contributors are Black people. But the target is on, let's call them the billionaires, what they term white monopolistic capital in South Africa. And if you really think about it, they control, if we're being generous, extremely generous, let's call it $50 billion that they're
no,
worth.
you're being disingenuous, Tinashe.
No.
PIC doesn't run a company.
No,
PIC
it's-
puts money, and there is somebody who
they
sits
could
at the
wake
top
up.
of that
They
money.
could wake up tomorrow. PIC could wake up tomorrow and
I
say,
think we're going down a rabbit hole. You were
Really?
explaining. You were
I'm
explaining the source of this. George's question was, with all this progress that we've made, why do people feel so angry? And you were
Thank you.
explaining this Marxist
That's-
that it comes from Marxism. We're going down a rabbit hole with the PIC. We can return to that.
no,
but-
PIC actually, it's the example
okay,
I'm
use
using.
less words.
It's the example I'm using to explain what a Marxist theory would look at it. The Marxist theory would say that it's the capitalist who has made money out of this and not PIC. So they would look at the white individual who happens to be white, right? Or be, or whoever it is, who has benefited and has made $1 billion. And they would look at that person as an enemy. And they would not look at that person is actually not an enemy. He's actually a product and a benefit.
But I don't think the guy who's carrying a flat screen TV running down the N3 is thinking in such a sophisticated manner.
This is how intellectuals.
Yeah, but let's talk about the guy who's running
Fred.
around with a flat screen TV on the N3.
He's unemployed. It's as basic as that. And as Rufaro said, he's up for hire. And as what's his name said, Kuitiswa. You know, it's very simple and straightforward.
Say that again in a Shona accent. For a moment, I thought you said something French.
Kuitiswa.
All right.
Kuitiswa. And it's very basic and straightforward. But the intellectuals will then frame it for us and tell us that it's income inequality. And whenever they say it's income inequality, what they are really trying to do is to drive you towards the Marxist theory, which is the class struggle.
But is it not income inequality when a guy lives in a tin shack and there's flat screen TVs in a mall next to his tin shack?
The idea is South Africa has done substantially better than the rest of Africa in the last 30 years. But unfortunately, what happened after Thabo Mbeki is that it's been in a serious decline, primarily because of these entitlement programs. 17 million South Africans are on some sort of social grant. And that number is growing. Why should those people work? They have no incentive whatsoever to work.
Rabbit hole, but I want to return to...
Sorry, I think today we've completely changed roles. Okay, yeah,
I want to focus on your question about, somebody living in a tin shack and somebody having a mansion and Lamborghini. So I think that the way inequality is framed, which tends to be quite disingenuous, is that the guy in the mansion with the Lamborghini has somehow, through very sophisticated but legal shenanigan, looted from all these people who are in tin shacks who would otherwise be living in suburbia. And that narrative couldn't be further from the truth. Because the guy with the mansion probably created a business that didn't exist, right? And has probably lifted some people out of poverty, created employment, actually made his community better, right? And the reason why...
He just chose to keep a decent portion for himself to buy a Lamborghini.
Absolutely. That's the nature of the game,
so
right?
Rules of the game.
We're going to come back to this.
And the guy in the tin shack, his situation has nothing to do with the situation of the guy in the mansion, right? The reason why he's in a tin shack has nothing to do with... it's because of a backstory and circumstances that are unrelated to the entrepreneur who built a business and lives in a mansion. So what the populists do and they do it very well, which is incredibly disingenuous, is they somehow weave this false narrative that the guys at the bottom of the food chain living in abject poverty are there because somebody is stealing from them somehow and is suppressing them somehow, which couldn't be further from
because they believe in zero-sum game, right?
Okay, so I mean, okay, so I think we are, or at least you guys are in some sort of agreement that the problem is not really that the guy's got a Lamborghini and a mansion. The problem is that there's still people living in tin shacks.
Yes.
Yeah, poverty is a problem in its own right, with its own causes, and it's a legitimate problem that we need to apply our minds to and try to solve.
Yes.
Thank you. So now, going back to my attempted question a few minutes ago. So China and India have sorted this out, and as a result, the humanity in general has taken one huge leap forward in 30 years. I think China has moved something like 600 million people out of extreme poverty in a generation.
Is it not interesting that China went through its communist phase, and so that it actually doesn't work?
Okay, so you're kind of preempting my question, right? So in the time that China has moved all these people out of poverty, we've moved people into poverty during the same 30-year period.
Well, that's certainly true in Zimbabwe. If you look at the last 4 years,
I'm talking about
added almost 1 million people into the extreme poor every year.
Yeah, and I'm talking about Zimbabwe, and I'm talking about the period since 1990, which is round about when ESAP started. Yeah, where have we missed the mark, or are we just on our way there? Do we need to go through this phase and we'll get there?
Convenience in many ways on one platform. Welcome to my own mutual is great. Insurance, investments, just on the banking. My own mutual is great. USSD, WhatsApp, okay, Konapo. My own mutual is great. Insurance, investments, just on the banking. My own mutual is great. USSD, WhatsApp, okay, Konapo. My own mutual is great.
Waba kukwanisa kuwa na services Old Mutual anasanganisira insurance, investment, net banking all on one platform. Usebenzisa password eyoto. WhatsApp le USSD. Chaya usta 227 hash. Bumbe ukutumela WhatsApp ku 0777 227 227. Ukuthi wenze wonke ku my Old Mutual.
Insurance, investment, savings, net banking. My old mutual is great. USSD, WhatsApp, okay, Konapo.
So that's a very good question, George. What has gone wrong in Zimbabwe specifically? I think it's not 1990, but I would say 2000. where we regressed. So liberalization. If you look at China, it's the largest labor market in the world, and it's totally liberalized. If you look at Zimbabwe, labor is not liberalized. If you look at title, right, what we did with land in 2000 is we took away title. So never mind the idea of taking land and giving it to the majority, but we then took out what is termed capital itself, which is the title. So that is already problematic. So issues of rule of law have not really been sustainable in the country. And I think that's where we got it wrong. That we've just, instead of us opening up the economy, we've actually closed it.
So you say on every important issue, we've done the opposite of what China has done.
I would agree with that. Sempa is a very good example.
Who's Sempa?
Okay, so he was a businessman in Zimbabwe.
Wasn't he a criminal?
He was. And, you know, he was in China. He went through the court process and he was jailed for corruption. But Zimbabwe refused to actually extradite him and also to provide evidence. So it tells you that corruption here is somewhat an acceptable phenomena. Whereas in China, it's there, but I think they've done quite a bit as far as corruption is concerned.
So I can't talk nicely to a cop at a roadblock after curfew?
I beg to differ. I don't think that. I think corruption obviously is bad, but I don't think it moves the needle at a national level in the way that you're framing it. And if you actually look at the corruption cases that have come into the public domain since Xi became president, they're epic. I mean, you can't make the stuff up. You know, there's a guy who had so much cash at his home. When the cops came to confiscate it and pick him up, they went through more than 20 money counters. These things were just breaking down because there was so much cash at this guy's residence until they gave up on
counting
on money counters, and they brought in scales, and they needed trucks to ship out this cash. So I think that corruption is a phenomenon that's obviously negative for economies, but I don't think it moves the needle the way you're framing it. I think that what China did,
India is famously corrupt, isn't it?
Yeah, it's also quite bad over there. But I think what moves the needle is your the rules of the game for capitalists. China has created so many super successful entrepreneurs. They might be reining them in now, but you've got Alibaba, you've got Baidu, you've got all these massive businesses that were built in the last 30 years in China. In Zim, we can name a handful of really successful entrepreneurs because the environment is not conducive for the emergence of entrepreneurs. So I think it's more your macroeconomic environment policy framework. I think that what happened to title and rule of law had a much, much bigger impact in as far as constraining growth here than corruption. Yeah.
So if I know that if I own something, it's mine, and the state will support me in enforcing my rights over this thing, whether I bought it or whether I created it, you reckon that is the number one driver?
Absolutely.
In entrepreneurship, and entrepreneurship in turn is the number one driver in eliminating poverty.
No, not entrepreneurship. So first is rule of law and property rights. Then the second thing is savings. So if you look at China, for example, their savings to GDP is next to 45%.
Okay.
Right? Zimbabwe has negative savings. So you cannot, your entrepreneurs, Zimbabwe has great entrepreneurs, lots of people with great ideas, but without the capital, it's next to impossible to grow. Every country that has grown, and this is the South African problem as well, every country that grows does so on the back of savings. So your typical equation is savings equal investments.
So why don't we have savings?
Have you thought around what has been happening in Zimbabwe for the last 20 years? We've destroyed our savings.
But I don't think it's savings. I think that
I'm really keen on how you're going to destroy that argument.
So I see where you're coming from, right? But I don't think it's savings at all. I think that if you create an environment, right, that offers exciting returns, right, you might in that particular jurisdiction not have savings, right? But capital will come in from outside jurisdictions because the returns are exciting. So an example on the global stage is the US, right? They don't have savings anywhere near the level of China, right?
But Chinese capital.
Chinese capital, European capital from all over the world, entrepreneurs and brilliant people from all over the world leave where they were born.
But Rufaro, you're only extending my argument. You're not. You're not arguing against my argument.
No, he is.
So the point
is arguing against.
So the point is Zimbabwe's got zero savings right now, right? Let's hypothetically, okay? If we woke up tomorrow and we changed the laws and we created a policy framework that made Zimbabwe an exciting destination for foreign capital, it would arrive in a heartbeat.
Not in a heartbeat, but there are two things that you're missing. The first thing is I did not say that the savings are local or abroad. I said savings. And the easier savings is always local, not abroad. You have to do a lot of things to invite abroad capital from abroad. There's just so much that you have to do. But the first thing that you need local savings because those are easier to get. And that's how China grew.
But if you're poor like Zimbabwe, right, and you don't have local savings,
okay, so that's a very thoughtful and interesting perspective. So savings in very simple, straightforward language, it's deferred consumption. What it means is whatever your consumption is, no matter your level of income, if you just consume less than you're currently consuming, that difference is your savings. So it actually doesn't matter where we are.
I think 6-year-olds get that. That's a very
no, but okay. An interesting extension of what Tinashe is saying is if you look at what has happened in this country over the last decade, during the US dollar era, we had a lot more savings and less construction. Domestic construction. People actually kept money in the bank. And there was building, but not as much as you see now. You see a lot more building now and less savings. Interestingly, even in this week's news, the government is crowing about the increase in US dollar deposits. So since they made it, since people got confidence that they can put US dollars in the bank and keep them there, the amount of US dollars in the bank is growing. And I would bet if you spoke to people like Lafarge and PPC, you would see the volumes coming off. So I tend to see sense in what you're saying, that everybody saves for a rainy day, but they choose how to save. When they don't have confidence in the economy and the currency, they save in something else that they're confident in. And one thing that Zimbabweans tend to be confident in is building.
Homes. And going back to your point, to Rufaro's point, first is because there's title, right? So let's be very clear about that property rights is sacrosanct. And then the second thing is you must have the savings. Now Zimbabwe is actually benefiting, and I'm quite sad to see that the government has not really taken a strong view on this, which is remittances, that our middle class is actually outside of our borders. And they're bringing in their savings and building houses and helping whichever way they can. So that's the second bit. So if you look at China, the first bit is title. That must be clear and very straightforward. And then the second bit is the savings. Then the third bit is the entrepreneurship. Now the fourth bit is the corruption. So I was not saying that lack of corruption is a bedrock of development. No, I think it's far down the lane. I think that if your property rights are sacrosanct, if you have a high savings rate, because if domestically you're saving, it means that your interest rates, for example, are positive. You have positive interest rates. And when you have positive interest rates, what's likely to happen is that international capital will come in. International capital does not come in because of the return, the business returns in an economy. No, it's usually portfolio flows. And those portfolio flows are really attracted by rate of interest in a particular country.
Okay, this is becoming a technical discussion,
Okay. All right.
which probably belongs on Analyst Insights.
Okay.
And also, we need to be home by 6. One other thing that perhaps we should touch on before we go home today. In the news today, U.S. inflation is starting to tick up. Really, for the first time in our adult lives, we seeing the U.S. recording inflation rates that are noticeable. Really, since 2008, they haven't reached current levels of around 5%. 5%. I mean, I know most Zimbabweans are thinking, so what? But I mean, this is big news. In 13 years, inflation hasn't been at this level, and a lot of analysts are expecting it to tick up a little bit over the next several months. What's driving this?
I don't think it's big news, because you've got to unpack it and understand why we're seeing high inflation at this particular point in time, right? So when we say annual inflation in the US is 5.4% for the month of June, right? We are comparing to the CPI index in June last year. What was happening globally in June last year, right? We were at the height of a global pandemic, and we were suffering significant economic slowdown, right? So a lot of manufacturers reduced capacity, the demand took a beating, and so the CPI actually, the base, right, actually came off.
But we didn't have negative inflation.
No, we didn't have negative inflation.
So I think that's a disingenuous argument.
No.
I think that's a disingenuous argument. So you can't say it's correcting.
No. Hear me out, right? So as businesses cut back capacity, right, to deal with significantly lower demand, they actually were very successful in reducing capacity, and they overestimated or they probably over-adjusted in their capacity.
But prices didn't go down, Rufus.
No. I haven't made my point yet.
So my point is, I think you need to get to it quickly.
Okay, so my point is, as the economy is starting to bounce back on the back of high vaccinations in the developed world, there are supply constraints that were not anticipated, right? Because people didn't think that the economy would bounce back so quickly. They didn't plan for a resumption of the same levels of supply. So there's supply bottlenecks. And what happens when there's supply bottlenecks is prices shoot up aggressively. Okay, so a classic example, like if you is the automotive industry is suffering from a shortage of chips, right? So they can't produce as many vehicles as they would like, right? So we've seen the used car market in the first world shoot up 10%, right? Because people can't get a brand new car, they have to resort to the second car market, and prices have gone up. So a lot. So I'm not saying that the 5.4% doesn't reflect significant price increases. I'm saying the reason for those price increases are to do with disruptions brought by COVID.
You think this got nothing to do with 20 years of printing money?
Certainly not 20 years of printing money.
It is. It's 20 years since. Wait, when was September 11th?
2003.
2001, right?
Yes, yeah, 20 years ago.
20 years, yes. 20 years of printing money.
Look, I think Tinashe's got a different view. But my view is that inflation, we're going to see it spike as we've seen in June, and it'll probably reach record levels in July or August. But these spikes that we're seeing are transient, right? It's not a reflection of some structural change in the economy. It's just an adjustment from last year and the supply constraints.
So you think it'll come back to normal? Tinashe, what do you think?
Okay, so first of all, your argument does not hold at all, and you couldn't even explain it to George, because George could see a hole. Because if you were correct,
somehow I think there's a veiled insult there, but okay, carry on.
Because if you were correct, then what should have ideally happened is you should have had deflation last year, and then it recovers and it's normal, right? So you would have a dip, and then an uptick, and then it normalizes. What I mean by that is, suppose the pandemic happens last year, right? and we do not inject any money into it, then George is quite right that there's a pandemic. So what happens is demand just falls away because people are at home, and because demand falls away and you've got lots of perishables, suppliers then are discounting their prices. So because they're discounting their prices, what happens is there's a dip.
There's negative inflation.
There's negative inflation. Then come this year, what would happen is demand starts coming in, and guys suppliers who are working on capacities of, let's say, 20%, 30%, they start increasing their what? Their supplies to meet the demand. And then you have positive inflation.
Prices rising.
But the net effect is more or less the same.
When you cancel out the 2 or 3 years, it comes
back to normal. But two things happened, right? The first thing is, when you had the dip, you then injected more capital. You injected, well, okay, let's be...
They injected cash.
They
printed money.
They printed money. So if you print money, what you're doing is you're artificially increasing the demand, right? So you artificially increase the demand, and what you're hoping for is that the supply side will catch up with that demand. But if the supply side is not catching up with that demand, what happens? And that's what we are saying, is that the supply side is not caught on with that demand. So you pumped in money, a lot of people
and it's just sitting there.
And it's just sitting there, right? But what has happened is the supply side has not reacted. Now it's dangerous. Why it's actually dangerous is that if the supply side is not reacting, what you're likely to get is that high inflation, the next thing that happens is employees will ask for
wage increases.
Wage increases. And when employees ask for wage increases, what happens to the supply side? Costs go up. You get into a vicious cycle. And that is what we're more worried about.
And if I can come in, Tinashe.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I'm being a little bit facetious talking about 20 years of printing. I think one of the big differences, but no, I mean, it has been 20 years of printing, but one of the big differences between the previous cycles of 2001, 2008, and so on, and the current one, is in the previous ones, the money went into production. Whereas in the current one, the declared intent of the Federal Reserve is to preserve asset prices. So the money is going straight into the stock market.
Is that they declared?
Yes, this is
0%.
They said they'll put in as much money as it takes to preserve asset prices.
The minute you have, so you have inflation of 5%, and you have the Federal Reserve rate at 0%.
I don't know which Fed you're talking about, because the Fed that I'm familiar with.
What's the Fed rate right now?
No. The Fed cares about two things. They care about unemployment and price stability. I don't know where I said.
No, but go and read what they said, because people asked, so when do you stop printing money? And they basically said when asset prices become stable.
I think it's also not 20 years. If you look at the inflation,
I admitted that I was being facetious.
Okay, but since 1971, we've seen what's different around this time around. I'll tell you what is different, is that there's less demand for the US dollar than perhaps 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Is that what the US dollar index is telling us?
Well, remember, when you look at the US dollar index, right now what you should be expecting is money flowing into the US. We're not seeing money flowing into the US. We're seeing people, asset managers, holding on to US dollars, which is quite different, because you have lots of people who are in US dollar debt. So internationally, you have lots of people who are in US dollar debt.
Okay, I think once again we're getting into a technical discussion, which perhaps this is not the forum for. But let's bring it home. Whether we agree or not on the causes of the 5%, we do agree that they've been printing money. We do agree that, I think, 5% inflation, okay, it's news, but it's not the end of the world. Why is
thinks it is?
Well, he thinks it will become if it continues.
No, it is, because it's negative. When you have negative interest rates, you're worried.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But 5% per se, okay.
If you're Zimbabwean,
you raise eyebrows.
It's nothing, yeah.
Whenever we try to print money in response to a crisis, all hell breaks loose, both figuratively and literally. So people make a lot of noise that we're printing money, and then inflation just goes crazy. Last time it was 230 million%. This time you're talking, depending on whose number you're counting, 200 or 300%. Why is it different? How is it that the Americans can do it and it's 5%, and when we do it, the wheels come off?
Supply and demand. No, there's no one internationally who's demanding Zim dollars, whereas the US can print because they still demand.
It goes
the
offshore.
US dollars.
It goes offshore. You don't have too much money in the US chasing goods in the US.
Exactly.
It goes
Exactly.
It
So
goes elsewhere.
without being technical, it's as basic as that. Zimbabwe, we print money, but nobody wants our Zim dollar.
So it chases Zimbabwean goods.
It chases Zimbabwean goods.
So how do we get out of crises?
Currency board.
We're not having that conversation.
Rivara, how do we get out of crisis if we can't print money?
We have to do hard things. We have to live within our means. We have to reform the policy framework so that we are actually a credible investment destination and foreign capital wants to come into Zim. And this is not going to happen overnight because we have such a long, well-documented history of
misbehavior,
breaking promises, of chopping and changing laws, rules, and regulations, that it's going to take a while before the world starts taking us seriously.
and indeed, we start taking ourselves seriously.
Absolutely. So I think, there's a line from the movie American Beauty.
Oh, there we go.
Today is the first day of the rest of your life, right? So, let's seize the day, right? Let's have an honest conversation about exactly where we are as an economy, as a country, and take the necessary, difficult, remedial action.
An interesting, the things you're talking about. I was having a discussion with someone this morning, and we came to similar conclusions. And it sounds like Reaganomics. It sounds like what Thatcher did. It sounds like what China was doing in the 80s. They all did pretty much the same thing. They cut government spending, they tightened their monetary policies,
Opened up the economy.
Economies, and were consistent about it. Most of our viewers today will be surprised to hear that the US once had inflation in our lifetimes above 20%.
That's how old we are now.
But this is in our lifetimes. The US inflation was that high, and the value of their currency was all over the place. The value of the sterling was all over the place before the mid 80s, until they did all these things. So if I'm hearing you gentlemen right, this is the medicine.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the medicine everybody else has taken.
You know that the UK had exchange controls until 1979.
Yeah.
So
Until Thatcher came in.
So we've got a wealth of data about economic policy that works and economic policy that doesn't. And I think
it's just that Chavez did it wrongly. You see, we got to try it a little bit differently from how Chavez did it.
We can't be getting inspiration from the likes of Venezuela. Venezuela is actually, one of my favorite case studies. They have the world's highest proven oil reserves, but I don't even think they're in the top 10 oil producers globally. And their oil production has been coming off over the last.
They just can't pump it. They just can't pump it out of the ground. It's the proverbial. They can't.
Hugo Chavez woke up one day and he decided to nationalize the entire oil industry, and he kicked out all the oil majors, and things have just been going south. We can't be inspired by such bad examples.
Yeah, but they just did it wrongly. They just didn't know how to do it.
Venezuela did it wrongly. Cuba did it wrongly.
China
under Mao.
Russia.
The Russians under Stalin. Because communism hasn't worked anywhere in the world, right? And coming back to what's happening in South Africa, wealth redistribution hasn't worked anywhere in the world. So, in as much as it might be just, right? You can say, look, they're legitimate historical, the reparations that are due, right? it depends on what X you're solving for. Do you want a better future, or do you just want to spite the guy who did imperial colonialism, right? What do you want to do? What's the outcome that you're looking for? And I think that wealth distribution doesn't work.
There we agree.
And the world's going a little bit upside down. Perhaps this is a good time to wrap up the show. It's been another fantastic Friday evening with you gentlemen. Some crazy ideas. And to our viewers, if sometimes you feel like we're crazy, just be reminded of one of my favorite playwrights, Samuel Beckett, who says, "We're all born mad. Some remain so." And whenever you feel like you're one of the ones that remained, perhaps have one of these. A couple of Panadol might help. Take a nap, and the world should be right side up again when you get up. In the meantime, enjoy your weekend. Stay safe. COVID is real. Be good. If you can't be good at it.